Good evening and welcome to our Good News Faith Conversations. Tonight will be the second part of our conversation with the Reverend Dr. Steve Larson. I hope that you caught last week's. If you did not, you can go back to our website and certainly catch up in that way. But tonight we're going to focus on Steve's story as it relates to following God's voice. Last week we talked about listening to God's voice. As we did this, I was thinking about the importance of stories and the realization that we all have a story, and certainly Steve's story is one to be shared. I remember a number of years ago when I sat at Sports Clips getting my hair cut, I was getting it cut by a woman by the name of Tammy. Tammy was Vietnamese, and she was just doing a beautiful job of cutting my hair and in a sense, kind of being very quiet and allowing me to watch sports on TV as I was getting my hair cut. She was asking about my hair, and I was sharing with her that my grandfather had just died, and he had died a day short of 102 years of age, and he had a full head of hair. I imagine that haircutters get tired of talking about hair, but she was sharing her story, how her father was imprisoned in Saigon for 12 years, and that at 20 years old, they immigrated to the United States, and they built a life here. And suddenly I thought to myself, wow, watching sports on TV, a rerun of a football game was really not that important. I needed to hear her story. So our stories are important. They're important to share. And I hope that you will enjoy the second part of our story with Steve Larson tonight, and that you will tune in again then next week as we talk about sharing God's voice. Thank you once again for joining us, and may God bless your day and your week.
So then the great thing about Urban Training Center is the fact that I learned the streets of Chicago, and I ran into in the program a wonderful nun, and we became quite close. After one night on the street, it was, I think, Thursday night, it was 1:30 in the morning. I was walking down this one street because I hadn't found a place to sleep. I looked across the street, and there's my friend, the nun. Of course, she's not wearing her habit. Mm-hmm. And I yelled at her, we're not supposed to meet, but it's 1:30, and I go, do you have a place to sleep? And she goes, no. Well, I don't either. How far are we from the beach? So we walked down to the beach of Lake Michigan, mm-hmm. and we got a bunch of boxes and dug holes in the sand because it was kind of cold. Mm-hmm. And I laid there with her all night. We slept, and I tell the story. I slept with a nun. Oh, well. But she taught me how to talk to gang members. She taught me how the gangs work. She would take me around and introduce me to the gang leaders. And if you know Chicago at all, you know the gangs pretty ran the city back in those days. Not that they don't now. But I felt freedom to walk anywhere almost without any identity or weapon or anything, and got to know how the gangs worked. And our job for the summer was to get the gangs involved with politics, because Mayor Daley was still the mayor, mm-hmm. and we wanted to influence him somehow, the gangs did, about their neighborhoods. So I helped them put that together. And they're kind of teaching me, right? Mm-hmm. I teach them basketball, because I was their basketball coach. Mm-hmm. But then they would take me on their runs. One night they took me on a run. We went out to a suburb, and the gang members could actually get out of the car, go open the hood of a car, and have the battery out of it in about 30 seconds. So I'm sitting there, and they're stopping in these rich cars and picking up batteries. Pretty soon the whole damn car's full of batteries. And they took me back home, and I just lived through it. I was scared. But they trusted me, and I knew that I had. I'm telling you this because this is what I learned to do on the street. I had to learn all these things about how to survive, and how to communicate with very troubled people many times. And of course, the seminary, when I later went back and got my doctor's degree, the seminary was right in the heart of the gangs. In South Chicago on 55th Street, if you remember where that was. How
did that? I want to back up just a little bit and just say, or ask you the question about how did following God's voice to this urban ministry, how did that really come about for you, do you think? I mean, what was it that drove you into this whole different kind of way to do ministry, you think, from your seminary days?
Phil Wahlberg. He's the one. If it wouldn't have been for Phil, I couldn't have done any of this. He came to Rock Island, and he interviewed me, and he then took me back to Fort Worth. It's funny, I'll tell you the story. He took me to Fort Worth. I got off the train, and he takes me around, shows me everything, and he said, well, tomorrow we're going to go hunting, because it was hunting time in Texas, right? So I get up, go to his, and he picks me up, and we go down to South Texas. And in those days, of course, I was a hunter from Minnesota, so I loved going hunting deer. And so we would go hunting, but we had to get to the hunting place. And I freaked out because if you had a beer in your car in Minnesota, you could go to prison. Well, we're driving along, going to the hunting, and he reaches back in and pulls out a bottle of beer, and he says, here's one for you, one for me. Yeah. Well, it's against the law, right? He's the chief of police. He was the chief, but he was the president of my congregation. And my congregation was a little white congregation in an all-black community.
And this is in
Fort Worth.
Okay, so we're moving from after this. So I'm just getting a timeline. So after your experience there in Chicago, is that when you received is that when you went to Fort Worth from
Yes, but I got sent right away by the church again to Nashville. And did a 3-week racism training. Back in those days, they brought the black people, some of them were clergy and so forth, but lots of Catholics and lots of nuns. We used to.
So you did a training, and then you went, and then Phil kind of then brought you to Fort Worth.
I think he was the one that got me going to Nashville.
Oh, okay.
He began to see in me somebody that could work in places nobody else has ever worked in.
Right.
We used to worship in the Beef and Boogie. In those days, there weren't any churches in black communities.
Yeah.
In fact, the man you mentioned had a church in Dallas, which was the first church that had anybody of color in it. And my church was all white, but I worked it really hard, and pretty soon it was about a quarter black, and people were beginning to feel good. And I opened up a program all week where the kids, when they came out of school, would come to the church and
so an after-school program.
After-school programs.
And is this is in Fort Worth?
In Fort Worth.
Whereabouts in Fort Worth? What part?
It's a Community of Hope Lutheran. It now has another name. I don't remember. But it was in southeast Fort Worth, and it was on Miller Street.
Okay.
Miller was a big street that went through. And we got a house in all black community, so we were the only white people in the neighborhood and so forth. And things were going really good. We had a lot of, members were coming and we were growing, but not with the blacks, just 2 black families to start with. And I kept working those after school things, and that brought a lot of people into the church. But then one day I get a call that this bus stopped in front of the church, and there were 2 kids fighting on the back of the bus, and the bus driver pulled out a gun and shot him. And of course, my white members never came back, except for the chief. And so I was really disillusioned. I said to the chief, I said, hey, I'll give you 3 years of my time if you let me go through the police academy. And that's where I began. So I started going to the academy and being a part of the training, except for a lot of the guns and stuff. I said, I don't need guns, I'm sorry. I said to him, I really want to do something different. And he said, okay. He said, I'll put a police radio in your car, and you've already had your training as clergy. You're learning about police officers, at least pretty good that way. And I'll put a radio in my car, and we're going to make you car 99. And we'll call you as backup to suicide attempts and homicides. We'll call you for backup with drunks and fights, family fights. That was always the biggest one.
Had you thought, Steve, about doing this even before the tragic shooting? Was this something that you had thought about? So that was the event that really led you to think. That was
God's call.
Yeah.
You see, that's the way I see it.
You responded to
Whoever would have thought of me going to the police academy?
Yeah. Well, of course, you listened to all those police reports with your dad long ago.
Yeah, well, that's right. So you got it. That went all the way back to me.
Yeah.
My dad likes to do that. And of course, in the seminary in Rock Island, right next door was a big fire station, if you've ever been there. And I spent most of my time hanging out at the fire station because that was what I liked to do.
So you were car 99. You were called to those kinds of intense situations where people were maybe holed up or maybe
see, now I can
suicide.
go to that and talk the rest of the day because I was on the street 17 years.
Right.
But I've written the highlights down.
Good. Thank you.
Because I'll give you an example. I got a Presbyterian newspaper magazine come to me and say, could I go with you one night on your ministry? Because I'm writing an article about your ministry. And I was paid by which I didn't say. But the Lutherans, Presbyterians, and Methodists all threw in money for my salary.
Okay.
So my chief helped me do that, of course.
Did you leave your call from the church, or were you still serving that?
No, I got the call then to go to do that.
Okay.
But there wasn't anybody that had done that, so they didn't know how to do the call.
Right.
But Phil Wahlberg figured it out.
So a specialized call then. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
And give you an example. I had this guy in my car, Presbyterian, and I'd hear the radio, and the radio was going, we have a guy here, he's really drunk, and he's in his house, and he's got 2 pistols, and he's wandering around, and we had to call the SWAT team. And I go, okay, what's the address? And I, of course, had to get on the phone with the dispatcher. And she gives me the address. I said, will you call them and ask them if the guy's name is Charles? And they did that. And they go, yeah, his name's Charles. Will you tell them I'll be right there? And they go, where are you? I'm way downtown, but I'll make it out there. And so we're driving along, and I stopped at a liquor store, and the guy goes, what are you doing? I said, watch. I went in and bought a half pint of Jim Beam, and got back in the car and got to the scene, and here's a SWAT team at every window, with their guns drawn. And he's in the house wandering like that when I get up on the porch, and the sergeant goes, Larson, you're not going in there. And I go, I don't work for you. And he let me go. I walked in. Charles saw me and he goes, Steve! Because I knew him from some bar. I hung out in all the bars in town. I knew all the weirdos and sick people in every bar. Excuse me. And I walk in, I hold up the bottle, and I say, Charles, I'll trade you this bottle for those guns. Oh, sure, just give me the bottle. And I had the guns. And the SWAT team goes, how the hell did you do that? Well, that's an example. Right. And I can give all kinds of understandings about how I did that. I forgot to tell you that back in Rock Island, I worked in the ER, and I delivered a baby. The rest of the ER crew went down to breakfast at about 4 in the morning, and this guy comes to the door, shakes the door, and I open the door, and he goes, my wife, she's having a baby. And I grab him, and I go, where is your wife? She's in the parking lot. And I go, oh, I had to go get a basket full of stuff. Out there in the parking lot, she's in the front seat of a Volkswagen, and she's about to crown, right? So I get in and pick her up in as best I could and put her in the back seat and put her 2 legs up on the front seat. This was a little Volkswagen Bug, and delivered the baby. And pretty soon everybody from the hospital comes up, and I'm sitting there with the baby. I don't have anything to cut the cord with, so I'm done with this, I guess. So they named the baby Stephanie.
That's good.
That's just a side story from back in Rock Island. But the ministry in Fort Worth, give you an example of how it would go. I got a call one morning, I think it was about 2 or 3, I worked all night usually, and it was about a woman who's sitting in her living room with a gun pointed at her head, and her 2 children are trying to talk her out of shooting herself, but she just discovered her husband had another woman. And so I drove to that place, and let me just tell you that all the way to each call like this, what I did all the way is pray. Yeah. And the prayer was show me what to do, because I never actually planned ahead to what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. But I had to be tender and listen. And it's like God would tell me what to do.
So that really defined your faith.
Yes.
In many ways.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Mm-hmm. And so I told you the rock.
So the woman had a gun. So you want to conclude with that story?
Oh, the woman had the gun at her head.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. This gives you an example of what my ministry was. So I walk into that again, the sergeant say you can't go in there. And I walk in, and she's sitting there like this. And because I have a collar on, she goes, "Oh, Father, thank you." And she puts the guns down, and she just opens up her heart. Mm-hmm. Because, and this is what I've been trying to get APD to do for a while, is to train the kind of person I was to be backup. We cut the suicide rate in half because I'm out there dealing with attempted suicide. And I was pretty good at that after a while.
What do you feel like they needed most of all? What do you think you provided for people in that situation?
An easy person to talk to.
Okay.
Not a gun, not a uniform.
Not authority in that
Not
way.
an authority figure, but this nice-looking man with a collar.
Yeah.
He doesn't have any interest other than caring about me.
So you were a presence of God in their life for them.
And he immediately put the gun down, and we had an hour-long conversation. And I used to have 3 or 4 therapists that backed me up in the morning, so I could call in all the things that happened, and the therapists would follow through. That's why it was an effective program.
Right. So you had a referral system that provided an immediate kind of help there. Yeah.
So let's see.
How did that, Steve? That's such a powerful part of your life, and in terms of even how it defined how you approached your vocation as a counselor in mental health and everything else. How did those experiences really define kind of who you are as a therapist?
Well, because I could do and think things as a therapist that therapists never thought of. So I could be effective that way. Yeah. But I was just learning to be a therapist at that time.
Sure. Yeah.
And I got all the training afterwards. Actually finished it in Fort Worth.
Oh, okay.
And my teacher is still there. He's marvelous. I had a marvelous teacher supervisor.
So while you were doing this police ministry, you were also doing work in your education.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to learn more what to do on the streets, actually.
That's why you went back to school for that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. That mostly was back in Fort Worth, I think. But I got involved in the congregations because the congregations supported Fort Worth Urban Ministries, which was a program. So I was out on the street at night, and somebody gave us an old warehouse to focus in the hardcore neighborhood, so we put our whole program in there, and we were housing homeless teenagers at night. Some of them weren't teenagers, and I'd, of course, have to sweep up the rigs after they'd all hid up. But we had a shelter that was in this old warehouse, and I got a partner. Out of nowhere comes this Missouri Synod pastor, and he's got a church close to where mine was, and he's looking if he could help me. So he joined me, and so did the Missouri Synod Lutherans.
Wow.
Yeah, so we had all these Lutherans involved there together.
Yeah, nice.
And that was a pretty good thing. But mostly we were always dealing with homeless people and runaways, and so the shelter wasn't big enough, and so we moved over to a street where we were actually given 2 houses to use. And so we put urban ministries in one house, and that had 3 or 4 pastors, 3 or 4 therapists that worked full-time there, because we'd bring them all in. We got to start being involved politically. We had lunch every noon cooked by the volunteers, beautiful lunches. So all the news media people would come over to our place for lunch. And they knew what I was about and what I did. So we would meet on Mondays or Tuesdays, and we'd talk about what was going to be the headline on Friday or Saturday in terms of all the political issues. I was the chairman of the School Human Relations Committee, and we, in that process, were trying to deal with the black and white churches. And I actually ran that organization, and then we were able to monitor some and move kids around and stuff like that.
Was busing and segregation a big,
yes,
the driving issue
was
there?
the big issue. So we got 2 churches, I think, that finally had blacks. And I was so involved at the emergency room at John Peter Smith that I would go there every morning before I went home and make sure that the suicide attempts that did attempt were going to do something. So that was usually the end of my day. And the congregations I got involved, one of them was called St. Matthew's. Gary F. Anderson was one of my closest friends from seminary, and he had this church in South Fort Worth, and that was one of the big involved churches there. So I would go out and be not the preacher, but I'd tell them what's going on in the street, etc. And so they gave us a lot of background and a lot of money. But the one good story is Christmas. I woke up and they didn't have a pastor. They were waiting for their new pastor. And so I woke up one morning and went, I keep losing where I am at.
You went to, you were pastoring the church for the Christmas?
Oh, yes. And so I had to go and, help him preach there. So I did that. And I said, now, last night I got this call from from the police department saying they had a family whose car broke down and they were on their way to California, and now they don't have any money or any place to stay or anything. And this was Christmas Day. So I shared that as part of my sermon and then blew it off and went to see them after church. And I got there and there was probably 7 or 8 automobiles lined up. And every one of them had Christmas gifts of some kind, a big, big meal. And the church stayed with these people and fed them and so forth.
A church without walls.
Oh, God, it was wonderful.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Great story.
And, it was because it was Christmas and because we had that kind of attitude about things. So,
must have been a good Christmas sermon, too. So.
Yeah. Well, one night I got a call from the dispatcher saying they had a teenager who was abused. Would I go meet her? So I did and found out that her father was abusing her. And I was I never told you about our house, but that's coming. Our house was our drug center. And I would meet people there. And he came to the drug center, and let's see. Remind me where I'm at again. Getting tired, I guess.
Yeah, that's okay.
Took me to our house, and I was. The guy came in and I laid it out for him and I told him I just came from the John Peter Smith where I met the police people from downtown and told them the story that I heard from your kids. And so they want to do something about that. So the guy came into our house and sat down, and I confronted him, and he looked at me and eventually started to cry. And then the whole thing came out about how he'd been abusing his 2 kids for years. And we took him to Waco, to the federal, to the prison, or the mental health place for because he was a soldier. So that's another good example of the kind of things we would do. But some nights I would deal with many things a night and then just go home and collapse.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But then I had to get up in the morning and run urban ministries. So I'd sleep from maybe 7 to 11 or noon, and then I'd go to work.
And then you made your house, you said, was it a drug treatment center?
No, it wasn't my house. We called it our house.
Our house,
And
okay.
the kids all owned it.
I got you.
It was a place you could get free therapy, and it was a place where you could come with any kind of drug and say, for instance, all the kids in those days were on LSD. And so the cops were constantly getting calls for kids acting out with LSD. And so we said, well, can we help you do that? And they said, okay, well, we'll call you when we have an LSD crisis. And so what we would do is go to a place where the cops were, take the kids, put them in our car, take them to our house, and for the next 4 or 5 hours, we'd sit, play music, and hold their hands and remind them that the LSD will be gone in about an hour. If you just hang on here with me, you're safe for an hour. And this could be a kid who one of the kids tried to burn the house down, and, a lot of crazy stuff happened with LSD.
Right. Yeah. So, Steve, you probably, in your experience in Fort Worth and your life there and your journey, following God's call there, could probably form a miniseries of stories.
It could.
Thank you for sharing this evening with us, and we hope that you can join us again next week with Reverend Dr. Steve Larson, and may God bless you in your day ahead.